Hi, my name is Greg Kraus. I'm a developer on the accessibility team at SAS, and today I want to talk to you about creating reports that comply with Section 508 using SAS 9.4 and how planning is the most important step. A lot of times when people give me reports and ask me, how do I make this accessible? A lot of times there have been a lot of decisions already made that make making the report accessible very difficult. And so I want to talk to you about some of those things you need to think about beforehand as you're starting to think about how to create your report in order to make the process of making it an accessible report that meets Section 508 guidelines to make that process easier. So I want to talk to you about 4 different aspects to plan for when thinking about accessibility in your reports. I want to talk about the file format that you choose. I want to talk about how you use tables and how you structure them. I want to talk about how you describe graphs, and I want to also talk about using color to convey information. So first, let's talk about accessibility in file formats. So some file formats have better accessibility features than others. One of the things you have to look at is how well does a particular file format work with assistive technologies like screen readers? Does a screen reader have the ability to read a Word document or a PDF document or a web page? How well do each of these different file formats work with assistive technologies? And then looking at some specifics of reports, how well do these different file formats handle some of the trickier things like table headers? And in each of these file formats, can graphs be made accessible in these formats? And finally, can you actually define good document structure in these different formats? Things like headings for your page, or if you have bulleted lists, that you can say that this is a bulleted list. So when we're looking at accessibility in file formats, I'm going to group this into 3 different groups. The first group I'm going to call things that have strong accessibility. And in this group, I've put HTML5 and PDF. Both of these file formats have a lot of support in there to work really well with assistive technologies like screen readers. They let you do things like define good document structure. You can define tables with headers, with multiple rows of headers and columns of headers and all kinds of things. You can describe your graphs and your images. So if you have a choice of what file format to use, I would always look to an HTML5 or PDF file format first. And I'll show you a little bit later why HTML5 has a few more advantages over PDF. There's a second group of file formats I want to talk about, and some of these file formats are a bit more specialized. Some of them, like Word, it's a more generalized format, but some of them, like Excel and CSV files and PowerPoint, they're kind of specialized. Now, file formats in this group can be made accessible, but they're often limited in what they can do. So we're going to look a little bit at how some of these file formats are limiting in what you can do, but if you only use them within those limitations, they can be very accessible. But if you try to push them beyond what they're really capable of doing, you can run into some problems. Then there's another bucket of file formats that just have weak to no accessibility, things like the RTF files or just the listing output from SAS. These just lack the very basics of what it requires to be accessible. For a person using a screen reader, oftentimes there's very little information they can actually get out of these types of formats because there's just no good structure to the documents. So let's look a little bit at HTML5. So HTML5, some of the features of this format is it really supports all the features a user needs in terms of document structure, tables, graphics, and all kinds of stuff. So looking at this from the ODS destination, so one of the really nice things about the HTML5 output destination is it can integrate with the SAS Graphics Accelerator, which is a really powerful way to convey graphs in ways other than visual formats. And we're going to look a little bit at the Graphics Accelerator a little bit later. One of the other really great things about HTML5 is it's the most flexible option we have in terms of creating accessible layouts, highly customized reports. You can use CSS, you can use JavaScript. You can do all kinds of stuff and still make it accessible. So let's look a little bit at PDF. So the PDF file format does support all the accessibility features users need in terms of document structure, headings, tables, and graphs, and all that kind of stuff. But there are some problems that start creeping in with PDFs. So if you end up making a PDF that isn't accessible because you've tried to make your report in a way that SAS was not able to fully make accessible. And there's a lot of ways you can do that because of the flexibility of the platform. If you've done that, you then have to go in and what we call remediate the accessibility of the report. And doing that is an extremely tedious process to go through and manually fix a document for accessibility errors. And you will find there are a couple limits to what you can design accessibly with PDF. You can still do quite a bit, but you'll start to find some limits. One of the great things about the SAS ODS destination, though, for PDF, is that you can create PDF files which require zero remediation work afterwards. So let's look at some of the more specialized formats, like the Word format. So Word supports most of the accessibility features users need. It can do things like good document structure, like headings and tables and graphs and so forth. You can start to run into some problems, though. If your tables start to get relatively complex, sometimes the complexity of the table in terms of like what headers go with what cells aren't always communicated to screen reader users. You'll often find some problems, especially if you get like multiple rows of headers or multiple columns of headers. Sometimes it can start to fall down, but for simple tables, it does relatively well. So with SAS, with ODS destination, you can create Word documents, which requires zero remediation work. However, you'll find that some reports might actually be more accessible if you went ahead and just made them as PDF documents. Let's look at one other format. Let's look at Microsoft Excel. So Excel documents can be made very accessible when your goal is to simply publish raw data. So some of the problems with trying to publish to Excel is that the layout possibilities are pretty limited. If you need to have a bunch of graphs and a bunch of prose and a bunch of other things like that, you can quickly run into problems trying to make that accessible. Excel works really well from an accessibility perspective when all you're doing is providing raw data. So it's perfectly accessible for that. Once you start going beyond that, it starts to become less accessible. So you can create Excel documents which are accessible given that you're only presenting tabular data. So again, looking at these kind of three buckets of file formats, the ones with the best accessibility are HTML5 and PDF. Ones with moderate accessibility, again, these can be accessible if you use them within their limitations, or things like Word, Excel, CSV, and PowerPoint. And then the weaker accessibility are things like RTFs and listings. Let's look a little bit at table structure. So tables of data can be made accessible in several of these different file formats, but some table layouts can cause accessibility problems. And what I've found is that almost all table structure problems can be reduced to one of three problems. So the first one being blank lines. So here I've got a very simple table, and the examples I'm going to show you here are relatively simple, but you can imagine these same instances in much more complicated tables. So this first problem of blank lines, this is a problem because when someone like a screen reader user comes to this table, the screen reader is going to report to them how many rows are in this table. And they're going to be reading down through the table and hearing data, and all of a sudden they're just going to hear blank. And they're going to want to know, well, did something just mess up? Am I not reading something in that cell? They don't really know that it's really just a spacer cell at that point. They're expecting to hear more data at that point. So the number of rows they're expecting doesn't quite match up with what the screen reader is telling them. Another problem are putting non-data cells within a table. So what do I mean by putting non-data cells in a table? So if we look at this table, and if we look at this cell here for the $26,990, that cell has headers which describe it. It is described by the Acura and the TSX 4-door and the MSRP. So I know how that cell is labeled. Similarly, down here in this other cell, I can see that it's labeled by Buick and the Regal GS 4-door and invoice. So those types of cells, those are data cells, and they have headers associated with them, so I can figure out exactly what this piece of data is about. But what about all these other cells I threw in here, where I was just saying all prices are in US dollars? You know, I was putting this in here as just an extra piece of information, but if I'm reading through this document as a screen reader user, I'm going to read down and I'll be reading about the various Acura cars, and all of a sudden I'm going to hear all prices are USD. That table cell has nothing to do with any of the headers that are already defined in here. It's really just an extra piece of information that's thrown into the table. So the bottom line is if a table cell does not belong and is not kind of owned by one of the header cells and described by a header cell, it probably should not be in the table because it's not really data at that point. The last group of problems that I find are headers not being defined. So in this case, I've got these subtotal lines. And just looking at this, you might think, well, why is this a problem? Because the subtotals come at the bottom of each break in the region here between Africa and Asia and Canada. The problem is if I'm reading through this table, I can be reading here on Nairobi and here it's $16,000, and then I'll read down and here's subtotal $119,000. And I know I'm still in the Africa region, so why is that a problem? Well, you can probably intuit what that subtotal means there. However, let's say I was reading this, I was exploring the table and I was starting to read from the bottom up. And so I can read that I'm in Asia and I read that Seoul is $60,000. I push up arrow and I read that Asia and Bangkok is $1,900. And then if I push up again, all of a sudden I'm going to hear subtotal $119,000 when the last thing I heard was about Asia and I hear subtotal now. So this is a piece of information that it is data, but the headers are not defined properly for this cell. And so I, as a user, don't actually know what that $119,000 or that $62,000 or that $385,000 actually refers to. Which subtotal does that belong to? So how do we solve these problems? So there's multiple ways to solve these. I'm just going to show you one example of how to solve each of these problems. So if you're having a bunch of blank lines in your table, it's probably because you're wanting to try to create some separation between parts of the data. Well, one way to do that is actually to create separate tables. So that's one solution to give your data a bit more spacing between them, but make it fully accessible. For the non-data cells, the basic solution is to move the non-data cells out of the table. So in this case, I just took that repeated reminder in there of all prices are USD, and I just moved that up and made it part of the table caption. And so it's no longer part of my table. I'm going to read it as part of the description of the table, but it's not going to be intermixed with all the data. Or here, where I have the headers that were not defined. So what I did here is I took, instead of putting the subtotal in that subsidiary column, I made a new label in the region column called Africa subtotal or Asia subtotal or Canada subtotal. So now as I read through that table, I will hear explicitly that $119,000 belongs to the Africa subtotal and the $62,000 belongs to Asia subtotal. I don't have to guess which subtotal I'm actually reading. So now let's talk some about how you describe graphs and what's possible in some of these different file formats and approaches you might take. So looking at this graph, there's quite a bit of information in here. So I've got a bunch of shoe sales reports from lots of different regions in the country broken down by 8 different products with this stacked bar chart. So a lot of information in here. How would I go about describing this graph to someone who can't see the graph? Well, there's a couple ways that you could go about doing this. So the kind of tried and true method is, well, you can provide tables of data. So here I've got a printout of some of the tables for that data. And you can do this and it will technically meet compliance. So what I've done is I took all those bars and I simply presented the raw data behind it. So now if I were a screen reader user, I could go through and I could actually read through this table and figure out what every single piece of information in there is. Now, there's some downsides to doing this. While this might technically meet accessibility compliance, it's not necessarily the most usable thing for users. So here, if I had a really big table, which, this is really only about 40% of the data that's populating that table. So the data is much bigger than what I'm showing. And so, if you can see the graph, we can glance at this graph and understand pretty quickly where who had the most sales, what products were selling the best in different regions. We can tell that just pretty much at a glance. If I give someone a bunch of tables, it's not quite as easy to figure that out. So while this will meet compliance, it's not the most usable experience. And I'll show you another option in a minute that can make this a far more usable experience. Another option to make a graph accessible is you could describe it in prose. And so here I've got a sample thing I might put in the body of my report saying the Middle East, United States, and Western Europe were our highest regional sales while Asia was our lowest. While all of that is true about that graph is conveying so much more information than what I said in that sentence. And so I can do that, but am I really conveying all the information that's in that graph? I would say that this option probably would not meet compliance in many cases. If all you put was this one sentence I put up in this example, this wouldn't be compliant because there's lots of information I'm not conveying. You might be able to do this for some simpler graphs and meet compliance, but again, it still can be very tedious to try to really understand the data behind it. So let me show you a third option. And this option I'm going to show you here will only work in the SAS HTML5 destination. So one thing we can do is provide accessible alternatives for graphs. So I created this graph with SAS, and you'll notice down in the bottom right-hand corner there's a little button called Accelerate. And when I click on that button, what it's going to do, it's going to take all that data that's creating that graph, and it's going to send it over to a free Chrome extension that we provide called the SAS Graphics Accelerator. And when you click on that button, it'll launch the SAS Graphics Accelerator, and it'll let someone explore this graph through sound. And they can actually hear the height of these bars, and they can actually dig into all the different groups within there. So when I click it, it launches the SAS Graphics Accelerator, and I can explore this through sound. So let's listen to a little demo here of just reading a couple of the bars and then digging down into a couple of the groups for one of these bars.
Africa, $2,342,588 total. Asia, $460,231 total. Canada, $4,255,712 total. Canada, $989,350 women's dress. Canada, $410,807 women's casual.
So when you're looking at describing graphs, you have a couple of options. You can do what I just showed with the SAS Graphics Accelerator. You can provide that alternative presentation, and that will work in the HTML5 destination. Or other solutions are you could use tables of data or potentially write prose to describe it. And you can do that in HTML5, you can do that in PDF, and you can do that in Word for relatively simple tables. Well, let's look now at the issue of designing reports that only use color to convey information. So here I've got a stacked bar chart, and I've got a table that has some traffic lighting information in there with red, green, and yellow. And so these colors are telling me things both in the stacked bar chart and in the traffic lighting table. But what if I can't perceive color? How will I understand the information behind this graph, or behind the graph in the table? So for example, I've got on the left here, I've got that graph with color where I'm only using colors. But if I can't see color, I created a version of this where the colors have been stripped out and it's all grayscale. And it's really hard, if next to impossible, to figure out what each of those stacked bars actually refers to. So when you're designing with color, you also need to think about how can I design so I'm not just using color. So here I've shown an example on the ggplot procedure where I can actually add patterns as well to my colors. So I get the same color scheme, but I also have a pattern added to it so that if I can't perceive the color, you'll notice on the graph on the right where I again have made it grayscale, the patterns are still there. And so if I can't perceive the color, I can still actually read this bar graph and understand what it's telling me and what each of the groups are. So here's that example again of the traffic lighted table. And so I was using red, green, and yellow to indicate different sales levels. You know, it's a high performing store, medium performing store, a low performing, I guess in this case, a product. And so how do I convey that if I can't distinguish color? And so what I've done here is I've added an icon to the traffic lighting. So for my high performing stores, I added the triple dollar sign. For the medium performing stores, I added the double dollar sign. And for the low performing, I added a single dollar sign. So now if I can't perceive the color between red, green, and yellow, I can see the icons and understand that. Additionally, if I'm a screen reader user and I can't see the colors or the icons at all, what I've also done, you can't really see this here, but on those images that I inserted alt text or alternative text on top of it. And so when a screen reader reads that 823, they're going to hear $823 and they're going to hear low performing because I said $1 sign equals low performing. And they'll get to the next line, they're going to hear $14,775 and they're going to hear medium performing because I made the double dollar sign the medium performing, the description for that. So hopefully this will give you some things to think about as you're creating your reports, things to think about before you start. What file format you're going to choose, how you're going to lay out your tables to make sure that they're accessible, how are you going to go about describing your graphs so people can understand them, and how are you using color in your reports to make sure that everyone can perceive the information. So we do have a resource available online. It's called Creating Accessible SAS 9.4 Output using ODS and ODS graphics. You can find it on our support site, and it goes into a lot more detail about how to use the ODS procedures to create accessible output for HTML5 and for PDF. So you can get a lot more information going there. Thank you for attending my virtual session, and if you ever have any questions, you can email me at my contact information, greg.kraus@sas.com. That's greg.kraus@sas.com. Thank you.